This is the version of the story most people know. The giant. A challenge. That terrified. The real story of David and Goliath. What most people miss. He stood over 9 feet tall. Clad in bronze armor that gleamed under the desert sun, his every step made the earth rumble. His voice was thunder, his presence, fear incarnate. For 40 days he issued the same challenge. Morning and evening, it echoed across the Valley of Elah. Send me a man, that we may fight. And for 40 days, not one warrior in Israel dared to answer. From the ranks of the Philistine army, Goliath of Gath stood as their champion. His body was massive, his weaponry unmatched. His armor weighed as much as a grown man. His spear was thick and heavy, impossible for ordinary men to lift. He didn't need to attack. His size, his words, and his reputation were enough. He terrified an entire army without drawing blood. Across the valley, Israel watched in silence. King Saul, once a mighty warrior himself, remained in his tent, paralyzed. The Israelite soldiers, trembling in their armor, looked to one another in shame and fear. No one dared step forward. No one wanted to face the giant army. And then, a boy steps forward. But this is not just a tale of a shepherd boy defeating a warrior. It's not merely an underdog story, nor a lesson in courage alone. Beneath the surface lies something much deeper. A divine setup, a prophetic moment, a mirror held up to the soul of a nation, and to ours. To understand the full weight of what happened in that valley, we have to go back. Before the battlefield. Before the sling. Before the stone flew through the air. We begin with a nation in crisis. Israel was in its infancy. Just a few generations removed from slavery in Egypt, it had now settled in the Promised Land. But it was far from united. Tribes were scattered. Faith was unstable. Enemies threatened them from all sides. The Philistines were among the most feared. Seafaring people with advanced technology, they were the masters of iron, while Israel still fought with bronze and wood. Their warriors were fierce, their cities fortified, their gods many. At this time, Saul had been anointed Israel's first king. He was tall, handsome, and at one point, courageous. But by now, something had changed. Saul had begun to walk in fear, not faith. He had disobeyed God, and the prophet Samuel had already told him, the kingdom would be torn from him and given to another. It was in this spiritual and political darkness that a shepherd boy entered the scene. David was the youngest of 8 sons. His father Jesse didn't even think to invite him when Samuel came looking for the next king. He was left in the fields, caring for the sheep. Alone but not forgotten. In the quiet hills outside Bethlehem, David learned to worship. He learned to fight. He learned to listen to God. He had killed a lion. He had fought off a bear. Not with an army behind him, not with an audience, but in solitude, with faith and precision. These victories went unnoticed by men but not by God. David was already being prepared long before anyone knew his name. One day, Jesse sent David to deliver food to his older brothers at the battlefield. What was supposed to be a quick errand turned into a divine appointment. As David arrived, he heard the shout. Goliath had stepped forward again, roaring his challenge. And just like before, Israel shrank back in fear. But David didn't flinch. He listened and his heart burned. Not with pride, but with holy anger. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, he asked, that he should defy the armies of the living God? To others it sounded like arrogance. To David it was simple faith. Not in himself, but in the God who had delivered him in the fields, who had given him victory over the lion and the bear. This Philistine would be no different. Word reached Saul. The boy wanted to fight the giant. The king tried to give him his armor, but David refused. It didn't fit. It wasn't his. He would not fight like Saul. He would not fight like the world. He chose 5 smooth stones from a brook. Not out of doubt, but out of discipline. 1 stone would be enough, but he came prepared for more. His weapon was a sling, a tool not of a warrior, but a shepherd. As he approached Goliath, the Philistine laughed. "Am I a dog," he shouted, "that you come to me with sticks?" Goliath cursed David by his gods and promised to feed his flesh to the birds. David's response was not bravado. It was declaration, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. This day, the Lord will deliver you into my hand." The battle that followed was over in seconds. David ran toward Goliath, not away. He reached into his pouch, pulled out a stone, and slung it. The rock flew with divine precision and struck the giant in the forehead. Goliath fell, face first, into the dust. David didn't stop. He ran to the body, took the Philistine's own sword, and cut off his head. The armies of Israel erupted with courage. The Philistines fled in terror. The tide of war turned in an instant. But the real story began before the stone was ever thrown. Long before the valley, before the shouts and the clash of armies, there was a boy in the hills. The world saw a shepherd, but heaven saw a king in training. David's days began before dawn. The air in the Judean hills was crisp, the sky a deep indigo before the sun crested the horizon. He would rise quietly, careful not to disturb the sheep, and listen to the world waking up. The bleating of lambs, the distant call of a dove, the soft rustle of wind through olive trees, these were the sounds of his sanctuary. He was the youngest in his family, the one assigned the least glamorous task. While his brothers learned the ways of war and politics, David learned the ways of patience and protection. He knew every sheep by name. He knew which ones limped, which ones wandered, which ones needed a gentle hand. He learned to lead with a staff, not a sword. But the hills were not always peaceful. Danger lurked in the shadows, lions, bears, thieves. David's hands, though young, grew calloused and strong. He learned to use a sling, not as a weapon of war, but as a tool of survival. He practiced for hours, sending stones whistling through the air, striking distant targets with increasing accuracy. Each day, his skill grew. Each day, his courage was tested. One night, as the stars blazed overhead, a lion crept into the fold. David awoke to the sound of panic, the terrified cries of a lamb in the beast's jaws. Without hesitation, he ran toward the danger. He seized the lion by its mane and struck it down. Another time, a bear threatened the flock. Again, David fought, and again he prevailed. These were not victories won for glory, but for love for his father's sheep, and love for the God who watched over him. In the solitude of the hills, David also became a worshiper. He carried a harp, its strings worn smooth by his fingers. He sang to the sheep, to the sky, to the God who seemed closer in the quiet than in the noise of the world. His songs were raw and honest, psalms of praise, of longing, of trust. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." These words were not poetry for an audience, but prayers whispered in the dark. David's heart was shaped in obscurity. He learned to find joy in the unnoticed, to find strength in the unseen. He was overlooked by his family, but not by God. When the prophet Samuel arrived in Bethlehem, sent by God to anoint the next king, Jesse gathered his sons. One by one, they passed before Samuel: Eliab, tall and strong; Abinadab, wise and steady; Shammah, brave and bold. But the Lord said no to each. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Samuel asked, "Are these all the sons you have?" Jesse hesitated. "There is still the youngest," he said, almost as an afterthought. "He is tending the sheep." Samuel insisted. David was summoned, still smelling of the field, his hair tousled by the wind. As he entered, the Lord spoke, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." Oil ran down David's head, a symbol of God's choosing. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. But there was no parade, no crown, no instant transformation. David returned to the hills, to the sheep, to the quiet. The anointing was real, but the appointment was not yet. Meanwhile, the nation of Israel was unraveling. Saul, once chosen by God, had turned away in pride and fear. He had disobeyed, offering sacrifices that were not his to give, sparing enemies he was commanded to destroy. The prophet Samuel confronted him, and Saul's excuses rang hollow. "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." Saul's heart grew troubled. The Spirit of the Lord departed from him, and a spirit of torment filled the void. He became restless, angry, unpredictable. His servants suggested music to soothe his soul, and word reached them of a young man in Bethlehem, skilled with the harp, brave and wise. David was summoned to the palace. So the shepherd became a court musician. He played for the king, his melodies calming Saul's storms. He watched the politics of power, the shifting alliances, the fear that haunted the throne. He saw the cost of disobedience, the emptiness of a crown without God's presence. Yet even in the palace, David remained a servant. He returned home when needed, tending sheep, running errands, honoring his father. He did not grasp for power. He waited for God's timing. It was during one of these errands that David found himself at the front lines of war. Jesse, concerned for his older sons, sent David with bread and cheese for the commanders. David arrived at the camp just as the armies were taking their positions. The valley stretched before him, the sun glinting off armor and shields. He heard the challenge before he saw the giant. Goliath's voice rolled across the valley, mocking, taunting, daring. David watched as the men of Israel shrank back, their faces pale, their hands trembling. He asked, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel?" The soldiers answered, "The king will give great wealth, his daughter in marriage, and exemption from taxes." But David's concern was not reward, it was honor. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? His oldest brother, Eliab, burned with anger. "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." David replied, "Now what have I done? Can't I even speak?" He turned away, undeterred. His faith was not shaken by the doubts of others. Word reached Saul. The king, desperate for hope, sent for David. The tent was heavy with the scent of fear and sweat. Saul looked at the boy before him, young, untested, unarmored. "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him," Saul said. "You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." David's eyes did not waver. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul, with nothing left to lose, relented. He offered David his own armor, bronze helmet, heavy coat, sword. David tried to walk, but the weight was too much. He shook his head. "I cannot go in these," he said. "I am not used to them." He took them off. Instead, David chose what he knew. He took his staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones from the brook. He walked toward the valley, alone but not alone. The armies watched in disbelief. The Philistines jeered. The Israelites held their breath. The fate of a nation hung on the faith of a shepherd. The valley was silent, save for the distant clatter of armor and the low murmur of 2 armies watching, waiting. The sun was high now, baking the earth, making the air shimmer above the rocks and wild grass. David's sandals pressed into the dust as he walked, each step a quiet defiance against the fear that had paralyzed a nation. He could feel the eyes of thousands on his back, some filled with hope, most with dread, a few with scorn. He was not a soldier. He wore no armor, bore no sword. In his hand was a shepherd's staff, at his side a sling, and in his pouch, 5 smooth stones, cool and heavy against his hip. Across the valley, Goliath waited. The giant's shadow stretched long and dark, his armor a patchwork of bronze scales that caught the sunlight and threw it back in blinding flashes. His helmet was crested, his legs protected by greaves, his chest encased in a coat that weighed more than David himself. In one hand, Goliath gripped a spear as thick as a weaver's beam, its iron tip gleaming, deadly. Before him, a shield-bearer trudged, dwarfed by the champion he served. As David drew closer, the ground seemed to tremble with each of Goliath's steps. The Philistine's face twisted into a sneer as he saw the boy approaching. He spat into the dust, his voice booming across the valley, echoing off the rocks. Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? Goliath's laughter was cruel, rolling over the Israelite ranks like thunder. Come here, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. The Philistine army roared with approval, their jeers rising in a wave. On the other side, the Israelites stood frozen, their hope flickering like a candle in the wind. But David did not flinch. He did not slow his pace. His heart pounded, but not with fear. He remembered the lion, the bear, the quiet voice of God in the hills. He remembered the oil on his head, the songs in the night, the promise that he was not alone. He called back, his voice clear and unwavering, carrying across the valley for all to hear. You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The words hung in the air, a challenge not just to Goliath, but to every fear, every doubt, every voice that said it could not be done. Goliath's face darkened. He moved forward, his armor clanking, his shield-bearers stumbling to keep pace. The ground shook with his fury. But David did not retreat. He did not hesitate. He ran. He ran toward the giant, not away. His feet kicked up dust, his staff forgotten, his hand reaching into the pouch at his side. He chose a stone, smooth, round, familiar. He set it in his sling, the leather straps worn soft by years of practice. He spun the sling above his head, once, twice, 3 times. The world narrowed to a single point, the exposed forehead of the giant, just above the rim of his helmet. David released the stone. It flew, silent and swift, a blur against the sky. It struck Goliath with a sound like a crack of thunder. The giant's eyes widened in shock, his mouth open in a silent roar. For a heartbeat, he stood, swaying, the world holding its breath. Then Goliath fell. The earth shook as his body crashed to the ground, face first in the dust. The spear slipped from his hand, the shield-bearer stumbled back in terror. A gasp rippled through both armies. The Philistines stared in disbelief. The Israelites blinked, as if waking from a nightmare. But David was not finished. He ran to the fallen giant, his breath coming in quick bursts. He drew Goliath's own sword, a blade so heavy it took both hands to lift, and with a single, decisive motion, he cut off the giant's head. Blood darkened the sand. The champion of the Philistines was dead. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, like a dam breaking, the Israelite army erupted in a roar. Courage surged through their ranks. The men who had cowered now charged forward, chasing the fleeing Philistines, their fear transformed into fury. The Philistines ran, their confidence shattered, their pride broken. The valley that had been a place of shame became a place of victory. David stood alone in the center of it all, the head of the giant in his hands, the sword of the enemy at his side. He was still a boy, still a shepherd, but in that moment he was also a deliverer, a vessel through whom God had shown his power. But the true battle had not been won with a stone or a sword. It had been won in the heart, long before David ever set foot in the valley. The real war was not between a boy and a giant, but between faith and fear, between trust in God and trust in self. Goliath had been defeated not by strength, but by surrender, not by might, but by faith. As the dust settled and the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the valley was transformed. Where once there had been fear, now there was hope. Where once there had been shame, now there was honor. But for David, the journey was just beginning. The victory in the valley was not the end of his story, but the start of a new chapter, a chapter that would test his character, his humility, and his trust in God in ways he could not yet imagine. The valley was still echoing with the cries of victory and the thunder of retreating Philistines when David, breathless and spattered with dust and blood, stood over the fallen giant. The head of Goliath, heavy and grotesque, hung from his grasp. The sword, so recently a symbol of Israel's terror, was now a trophy of deliverance. The Israelite soldiers surged past him, their fear forgotten, their courage rekindled. They chased the Philistines all the way to the gates of Ekron and Gath, cutting them down as they fled. The ground was littered with abandoned shields, broken spears, and the bodies of those who had once mocked the God of Israel. For the first time in weeks, the camp of Israel was filled with laughter and song. Men who had hidden in their tents now boasted of their bravery. The shame that had hung over the nation like a shroud was lifted. The impossible had happened. A boy had slain a giant, and the enemy had been routed. But as the dust settled and the adrenaline faded, the reality of what had occurred began to sink in. The soldiers gathered around David, staring in awe and disbelief. Some reached out to touch him as if to make sure he was real. Others whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with wonder and a hint of fear. "Who is this boy?" they asked. "Where did he come from? How did he do it?" David, for his part, was quiet. He did not bask in the adulation. He did not boast or demand recognition. He simply stood, the weight of the moment pressing in on him. He knew that the victory was not his alone. It belonged to the Lord. Word spread quickly through the camp. Saul, who had watched the battle from a distance, summoned David. The king's tent was a place of shadows and tension. Saul's eyes, once bright with hope, were now clouded with something darker: envy, confusion, perhaps even fear. He looked at David, still holding the head of Goliath, and asked, "Whose son are you, young man?" David answered simply, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." Saul studied him, searching for some sign, some explanation. How could this boy, this shepherd, have done what no warrior in Israel dared to attempt? How could he have faced the giant and lived? The answer was not in David's strength, but in his preparation. The battle in the valley was won long before the stone ever left the sling. It was won in the hills of Bethlehem, in the quiet places where David learned to trust God, to fight for what mattered, to worship in the dark. Most people see only the moment of victory, the stone, the fall, the roar of the crowd. But the real story is written in the years of obscurity, in the faithfulness when no one is watching. David was not an overnight success. He was a product of discipline, of devotion, of daily choices to trust God in the small things. The 5 stones he chose from the brook were not a sign of doubt, but of discipline. He was prepared for whatever might come. Some say Goliath had 4 brothers, and David was ready to face them all. Others see in the stones a symbol of readiness, a willingness to do whatever was required, to keep fighting until the battle was truly won. The sling, too, was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of David's identity. He did not try to be someone he was not. He did not wear Saul's armor or wield a sword he had never used. He fought with what he knew, with what God had already placed in his hand. There is a lesson here for all who face giants. Victory does not come from pretending to be someone else, from copying the methods of the world. It comes from embracing who God has made you to be, from using the gifts He has given, from trusting that He can do more with your weakness than you could ever do with your strength. As the celebrations died down and the camp settled into an uneasy peace, David's life began to change. He was no longer just a shepherd or a musician. He was a hero, a symbol of hope, a threat to those who clung to power. Saul at first welcomed him. He made David a commander in his army, sent him on missions, and watched as the young man succeeded in everything he did. The people loved David. They sang songs about him, songs that praised his courage, his victories, his faith. But Saul's heart grew dark. The cheers that once lifted his spirit now stung like barbs. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. The women sang as the army returned from battle. Jealousy took root, twisting Saul's thoughts, poisoning his soul. He began to see David not as a blessing, but as a rival. He threw spears in fits of rage. He plotted to have David killed in battle. He offered his daughter in marriage, hoping to entangle David in political traps. But through it all, David remained faithful. He honored Saul, served him, played music to soothe his troubled mind. David's victory over Goliath had made him famous, but it was his humility, his patience, his refusal to take shortcuts that would make him king. He waited for God's timing, trusting that the one who had delivered him from the lion, the bear, and the giant would also deliver him from the schemes of men. The Valley of Elah became a place of legend, a symbol of what God can do through those who trust Him. But for David, it was also a reminder that the greatest battles are often fought in secret, that the true measure of a person is not found in moments of glory, but in years of faithfulness. The story of David and Goliath is not just about a boy and a giant. It is about the heart of a nation, the soul of a leader, the faith of a servant. It is about the God who sees what others overlook, who chooses the humble, who prepares His champions in the quiet places. It is a story that echoes through the ages, calling each of us to face our own giants, not with bravado but with faith, not with the weapons of the world, but with the tools God has placed in our hands, not in our own strength, but in the name of the Lord. The sun set slowly over the Valley of Elah, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. The battlefield, once a place of dread, was now a place of memory. The Israelites gathered their wounded, counted their dead, and sang songs of deliverance. The Philistines, humiliated and broken, retreated to their cities, their pride shattered by the fall of their champion. But the story did not end with the victory. In many ways, it was only beginning. The legend of David and Goliath would be told and retold, not just as a tale of courage, but as a parable of faith, a story that would shape the identity of a people and the destiny of a king. For David, the aftermath was a whirlwind. He was brought before Saul, still holding the head of Goliath, still stained with the dust and blood of battle. The king's court was filled with whispers and stares. Some looked at David with awe, others with suspicion. Saul's own son, Jonathan, watched with shining eyes, his heart knit to David's in instant friendship. Jonathan, a prince and a warrior in his own right, saw in David a kindred spirit, a man who valued honor above ambition, faith above fear. He took off his robe and gave it to David, along with his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt. It was a gesture of covenant, a sign that Jonathan recognized God's hand on David's life. David's fame spread quickly. Everywhere he went, people spoke his name with reverence. Mothers told their children the story of the shepherd boy who had slain the giant. Old men recounted the day when hope returned to Israel. The songs grew louder, the legends grander. But David did not let the praise go to his head. He remembered the hills, the sheep, the quiet voice of God. He knew that the same God who had given him victory could also humble him. He walked carefully, honoring Saul, serving faithfully, waiting for God's timing. Yet the shadow of the giant lingered. Goliath was dead, but the spirit of fear he had unleashed was not so easily banished. Saul's jealousy grew, fed by insecurity and suspicion. He saw threats everywhere, especially in David. The king's love turned to hatred, his trust to paranoia. David's life became a series of escapes and exiles. He fled from Saul's spear, hid in caves, wandered the wilderness with a band of outcasts and misfits. He learned to depend on God in new ways, to find strength in weakness, to trust in promises that seemed impossible. Through it all, the memory of the valley remained, a touchstone of faith, a reminder that God could do the impossible. David carried with him the sword of Goliath, a trophy not of his own strength, but of God's deliverance. When he was hungry and desperate, he returned to the tabernacle, and the priest gave him the sword. "There is none like it," David said, and he took it as a sign that God was still with him. The story of David and Goliath is rich with symbolism. The valley itself is more than a geographical location. It is a spiritual landscape, a place where faith is tested and refined. In the Bible, valleys are often places of decision, of encounter, of transformation. The Valley of Elah was a crucible, a place where the old order died and a new one was born. Goliath represents more than just a physical enemy. He is the embodiment of every force that opposes God's people: fear, intimidation, pride, unbelief. He is the voice that says, "You are not enough. You cannot win. You will be defeated." He is the shadow that looms over every heart, whispering lies, sowing doubt. David, on the other hand, is a picture of faith, not perfect faith, but real faith. Faith that is honest about fear, but refuses to be ruled by it. Faith that remembers God's faithfulness in the past and trusts Him for the future. Faith that steps forward when everyone else steps back. The 5 stones David chose from the brook are a symbol of preparation. He did not assume that one stone would be enough, nor did he presume upon God's favor. He was ready for whatever might come. Some have speculated that Goliath had 4 brothers, and David was prepared to face them all. Others see in the stones a reminder that faith is not reckless. It is disciplined, thoughtful, prepared. The sling, too, is a symbol. It was not the weapon of a warrior, but of a shepherd. David did not try to be someone he was not. He did not wear Saul's armor or wield a sword he had never used. He fought with what he knew, with what God had already placed in his hand. There is a lesson here for all who face giants. God does not ask us to be someone else. He asks us to be faithful with what we have. The battle itself is a picture of spiritual warfare. The Apostle Paul would later write, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." Ephesians 6 verse 12. The giants we face may not be 9 feet tall, but they are no less real: fear, addiction, despair, injustice, doubt. The victory in the valley was not just for David, but for all of Israel. It was a turning point, a moment when the tide shifted, when hope was reborn. The people who had cowered in fear now surged forward in faith. The shame that had paralyzed them was broken. The name of the Lord was honored. But the story is not just about the past. It is about the present. It is about the giants we face in our own lives, the challenges that seem insurmountable, the fears that threaten to overwhelm us, the doubts that whisper that we are not enough. It is about the call to step forward in faith, to trust that God is with us, and to believe that the battle belongs to the Lord. Every generation has its giants. Every heart has its valley. The story of David and Goliath is a call to courage, a summons to faith, a reminder that God delights in using the unlikely to accomplish the extraordinary. Centuries have passed since the dust settled in the Valley of Elah, but the story of David and Goliath still lives. It is told in Sunday schools and whispered in hospital rooms, recited by athletes before the big game and by parents comforting a child in the dark. It is a story that belongs to all who have ever felt small, outmatched, or afraid. Why does this ancient battle still speak to us? Because the giants have not disappeared. They have only changed their names. For some, the giant is fear: fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of the unknown. It stands tall, shouting down every hope, every dream, every step of faith. For others, the giant is shame, a memory that will not fade, a mistake that will not be forgotten, a voice that says, "You are not worthy." For still others, the giant is pain, loss, betrayal, disappointment, or grief. It looms over the heart, casting a shadow that seems impossible to escape. There are giants of addiction, of anxiety, of depression. Giants of poverty, of injustice, of broken relationships. Giants that mock our faith, that challenge our identity, that threaten our peace. They stand in the valley, morning and evening, daring us to believe that we are alone, that we are powerless, that we will never win. But the story of David and Goliath whispers a different truth. It reminds us that the battle is not ours alone, that we are not defined by the giants we face, but by the God who fights for us. David's victory was not the result of luck or skill alone, but of faith. Faith that God was bigger than the giant, faith that God's promises were true, faith that God's power was made perfect in weakness. He did not deny the reality of the giant. He did not pretend that the battle was easy, but he refused to let fear have the final word. What giants are you facing today? What stones are in your hand? The battle may seem impossible, but you are not alone. The God who was with David in the valley is the same God who is with you now. David's story is not just about a boy and a giant. It is about you and the battles you are called to fight. It is about the moments when you feel small, overlooked, or unprepared. It is about the times when you are called to step forward, to trust in God, and to believe that He can do the impossible. The real story of David and Goliath is not just a tale of ancient heroism. It is a call to courage, a summons to faith, a reminder that God delights in using the unlikely to accomplish the extraordinary. But there is another lesson, one that is often missed. David did not become a giant slayer in the valley. He became a giant slayer in the field, alone, unnoticed, unseen. The valley only revealed what had already been built in private. When the lion came, he did not run. When the bear attacked, he did not pray for someone else to handle it. He fought. He protected. He learned to trust God when no one else was watching. And when the time came to stand before the giant, he did not become something new. He simply became what he already was. That is the making of a giant slayer. It is not about fame, or skill, or spotlight. It's about character, integrity, preparation. The greatest battles are often won far away from the noise, on hillsides, in prayer closets, in quiet obedience, in the little decisions no one sees. This story is not just about David. It's about what God can do with a willing heart. It reminds us that the ones overlooked by men are often chosen by God. That the least likely are often the most ready. That strength is not in sword or armor, but in surrender. And so, the boy with the sling becomes the man after God's own heart. The shepherd becomes the king. The giant falls. The people rejoice. But the lesson lingers. Because every generation has its giants. And every generation needs its Davids. Not those who are fearless, but those who fear God more than they fear man. Not those who are strong, but those who are surrendered. Not those who seek glory, but those who obey the quiet whisper of God's voice. The real story of David and Goliath is not just about overcoming fear. It's about trusting the unseen hand of God when everything visible says you'll lose. And when you walk into your valley, stone in hand, heart steady, eyes fixed on heaven, know this. You are not alone. And no giant, no matter how tall, how loud, or how long he's been shouting, can stand against the name of the Lord. The legacy of David's faith did not end with Goliath. It shaped a nation, inspired prophets, and pointed forward to another unlikely champion, one who would come from David's own line, born in Bethlehem, humble and unassuming, yet destined to change the world. Jesus, the son of David, would face the greatest giant of all, not with sword or spear, but with a cross. He would stand alone in the valley of death, mocked and rejected, yet trusting in the Father's plan. And in his victory, every giant, sin, death, fear, would fall. David's story is a shadow of a greater story, a promise that God is always at work, even in the darkest valleys, even in the fiercest battles. So when you find yourself in the valley, facing giants that seem too big to defeat, remember David. Remember the field, the lion, the bear. Remember the stone, the sling, the name of the Lord. And remember that the battle is not yours alone. The valley is quiet now. The sun has set, and the shadows stretch long across the land. The echoes of battle have faded, but the lessons remain, etched into the memory of a people and the heart of every soul who has ever stood before a giant. David's story is not just a relic of ancient history. It is a living parable, a mirror held up to our own lives. We all have valleys. We all have giants. Some are visible, illness, loss, injustice, addiction. Others are hidden, fear, insecurity, regret, the wounds no one else can see. The giants taunt us, morning and evening, just as Goliath did. They remind us of our failures, our limitations, our past. They tell us that we are too small, too weak, too broken to make a difference. They dare us to believe that God is absent, that hope is lost, that victory is impossible. But the story of David and Goliath is a declaration that the giants do not have the final word. The valley is not the end of the story. The God who was with David is the same God who is with you. David's courage was not the absence of fear, but the presence of faith. He did not deny the reality of the giant, but he refused to be defined by it. He remembered the faithfulness of God in the past, the lion, the bear, the anointing oil, the quiet voice in the night. He trusted that the God who had been with him in the field would be with him in the fight. He did not wait for perfect conditions. He did not wait to be noticed, promoted, or approved. He stepped forward when the need arose, bringing what he had, trusting that God would do what only God could do. That is the invitation of this story, not to be fearless, but to be faithful. Not to have all the answers, but to trust the one who does. Not to fight with the weapons of the world, but with the tools God has placed in your hand. What is your sling? What are your stones? What has God given you, shaped in the quiet places, prepared in the hidden years? It may not look like much to others. It may not seem impressive or powerful. But in the hands of faith, it is enough. The world celebrates the visible victories, the moments when the giant falls, when the crowd cheers, when the story is told. But heaven celebrates the unseen faithfulness, the nights spent in prayer, the choices made in secret, the trust that holds fast when no one else believes. David's greatest victory was not in the valley, but in the field. The battle was won long before the stone was ever thrown. It was won in the daily decisions to trust, to obey, to worship, to prepare. And so it is with us. The giants we face are not defeated in a single moment of glory, but in 1,000 moments of faithfulness. The valley is only the stage. The real story is written in the heart. As you stand in your own valley, facing your own giants, remember this: you are not alone. The God who called David calls you. The God who equipped David equips you. The God who delivered David will deliver you. You may feel small. You may feel unprepared. You may feel overlooked or forgotten. But God sees you. He knows your name. He has been preparing you in ways you cannot yet see. The valley is not a place of defeat, but a place of encounter. It is where fear is faced, where faith is forged, where God's power is revealed. It is where the impossible becomes possible, where the weak become strong, where the overlooked become overcomers. The story of David and Goliath is not just about a boy and a giant. It is about the God who chooses the unlikely, who uses the humble, who delights in doing the extraordinary through the ordinary. It is about the power of faith, the beauty of obedience, the strength of surrender. It is about the hope that endures, the courage that rises, the love that never fails. So, what is the giant in your life? What valley are you standing in? What stones are in your hand? Will you shrink back in fear, or will you step forward in faith? Will you listen to the taunts of the giant, or to the whisper of God's promise? Will you trust in your own strength, or in the name of the Lord? The choice is yours. The invitation is open. The valley awaits. And as you step forward, remember, the battle is not yours alone. The battle is the Lord's. He is with you. He is for you. And no giant, no matter how tall, how loud, or how long he's been shouting, can stand against the name of the Lord. Let the story of David and Goliath be more than a legend. Let it be a living truth, a daily reminder, a call to courage and faith. Because the real story is not just about a giant that fell, but about a God who still moves mountains, who still slays giants, who still calls shepherds to be kings. And that story, your story, is still being written. What will you do when your moment comes? What will you do when the valley is silent, and the giant stands before you? Will you run? Or will you remember? Will you trust? The world is waiting. The valley is waiting. Your story is waiting. Pick up your stone. Step into the valley. And watch what God will do. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more powerful, faith-filled narratives like this, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new video. We'd love to hear from you. What giants are you facing, and how has this story inspired you? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And if you know someone who needs encouragement today, share this video with them. Together, let's build a community of hope, courage, and faith. Thank you for watching.